11:32 a.m. May 24th, 1940. The south bank of the Aa Canal, just 15 miles from the coast of Dunkirk. The ground shook. It wasn't from bombs, but from the sheer weight of hundreds of Panzer tanks roaring in unison. The 1st Panzer Division, the armored spearhead under General Heinz Guderian, was at a fever pitch. Through the binoculars of German tank commanders, the target was clear as day. Dunkirk. It was the final trap. Inside that trap were over 300,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force and the French Army. They were breaking, they were panicking, they were pushed to the water's edge, backs to the sea, with nowhere left to run. For a German tanker in May 1940, this was the moment of absolute glory. They had torn through the French defenses, pierced the Ardennes, and now they were about to seal the coffin on the British Army. Just 2 hours of marching. Just cross this canal, and they would crush the enemy's main force right on the beaches. Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, knew this. He could smell victory mixed with the scent of diesel and dust. The enemy was broken. No anti-tank guns, no fortified positions. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a massacre. But then, the radio crackled. An order arrived from Army Group A Command, signed by General von Rundstedt and approved personally by Hitler. Order number 13. Its content was short, but its impact was more devastating than any bomb. Halt. The German tank commanders couldn't believe their ears. They asked for confirmation. Was there a mistake? The enemy was right there, defenseless. Why stop? But the answer from the other end of the line was cold and final. Stop immediately at the Aa Canal line. Do not cross. Wait for further orders. The engines of the Panzer IVs roared one last time, then died out. Silence fell over the battlefield. A strange, terrifying silence. Guderian stood in the turret of his command vehicle, staring toward Dunkirk. He was furious. In the mind of a field general, this was madness. The core principle of Blitzkrieg is speed. You never give the enemy time to breathe. You pursue to the end. But now, the world's mightiest war machine was tied down by an invisible string from Berlin. Why? In Berlin, and at Rundstedt's headquarters, fear was creeping in. Not fear of the British, but fear of their own success. The old guard German generals were worried. The tanks had moved too fast. The infantry was lagging dozens of miles behind. The flanks of the armored spearhead were exposed. They feared a French counterattack from the south, a ghost from the First World War. And Hitler? Hitler wanted to prove his power. He wanted the arrogant Panzer generals to understand that he, not they, controlled this war. Meanwhile, on the other side of the canal, exhausted British soldiers looked up at the sky. They were waiting for death. They were waiting for the sound of tank tracks crushing their temporary shallow foxholes. But nothing happened. No engine roar, no 75mm direct fire. The Germans had stopped. The British soldiers didn't know why. They only knew they had just been granted the most precious gift in war, time. The clock began to tick. The fatal 48 hours had begun. While German generals argued over maps in luxurious rooms, out on the beaches, chaos was slowly turning into a chance for survival. The German tanks, born predators, now had to lie still, watching their prey slowly, very slowly, find a way to escape. But Guderian didn't know that this pause wouldn't just last a few hours. It would last long enough to change world history. Across the English Channel, Admiral Bertram Ramsay was looking at a map in Dover Castle. He knew how desperate the situation was. Prime Minister Churchill had been told that Germany could wipe out the British Army in days. Hoping to rescue 30,000 men was already considered a miracle. But when the scout report came in, German tanks have halted at the Aa Canal. Ramsay saw a narrow crack in the door, a crack of life. Operation Dynamo hadn't officially begun, but the life of the British Empire was hanging by a thread, and that thread had just been loosened by their own enemy. The German panzer crews cut their engines, lit cigarettes, and waited. They thought this was just a pause to refuel, to maintain their machines. They didn't know that they had just lost the greatest victory of their lives. The silence on the south bank of the Aa Canal was unnatural. For the panzer crews, men who had spent 2 weeks living in the deafening roar of engines and the sharp crack of high-velocity guns, this stillness felt wrong. It felt dangerous. They climbed out of their steel beasts, stretching limbs cramped from days of relentless combat. They looked across the narrow strip of water. Through the heat haze, they could see the steeples of Dunkirk in the distance. It was so close. The prize was right there. But the order remained absolute. Halt. General Guderian was pacing like a caged animal. He fired off message after message to headquarters, demanding an explanation. The official reasoning that trickled down was infuriatingly cautious. They were told the terrain around Dunkirk was too marshy for tanks. They were told the armor needed to be preserved for the final push south into France. They were told to wait for the infantry to catch up. To Guderian, these were excuses born in offices, not realities of the field. The ground was hard, the tanks were ready, the enemy was breaking. But the chain of command, usually the Wehrmacht's greatest strength, had become a noose around its neck. While the Germans debated over maps, the British were not idle. On the northern bank, the initial shock of survival was quickly replaced by frantic activity. The British soldier is famous for his ability to dig, and on that afternoon, they dug for their lives. Spades struck the earth. Shallow foxholes turned into trenches. Machine gun nests were established. Anti-tank rifles were positioned. Every hour the Panzers sat idle was an hour the British used to turn a rout into a fortress. General Lord Gort, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, realized the reprieve he had been given. He began pulling his divisions back, tightening the perimeter around the port. He was shrinking the target, thickening the shield. Had the Germans attacked immediately, they would have sliced through disorganized columns of retreating men. Now, they would face a solid wall of desperate defiance. But back in Germany, a new player entered the tragedy, sealing the fate of the Halt order. Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe. Göring, ever jealous of the army's glory, saw an opportunity to claim the victory for himself. He contacted Hitler. He promised the Führer that his air force alone could annihilate the trapped Allied army. "My Luftwaffe will close the trap," he boasted. "The tanks are not needed. Let them rest." Hitler, who always favored political maneuvering over military pragmatism, loved the idea. It spared his precious tanks. It checked the power of the army generals. And it gave the glory to the Nazi Party's air force. It was a decision made on ego, not tactics. As the sun began to set on May 24th, the first critical hours of the window had vanished. The German tanks remained parked, their engines cold. The crews boiled coffee and repaired tracks, unaware that just a few miles away, the chaos of the British retreat was organizing into a disciplined defense. The sky above Dunkirk began to darken, not just with night, but with the smoke of burning oil reserves set alight by the retreating Allies. Under that black pall, the miracle of Dunkirk was beginning to take shape. It wasn't a miracle of divine intervention. It was a miracle granted by a German halt order. The predator had stopped to sharpen its claws, giving the prey just enough time to realize the cage door was still open. May 25th, 1940. The sun rose over a battlefield that had fallen into a surreal, almost hypnotic trance. For the German 19th Army Corps, this should have been the morning of the final assault. Instead, it became the day of the long wait. The halt order was still in effect. The engines remained cold. The tank crews, the elite predators of the Wehrmacht, found themselves doing something they despised. They were becoming spectators in their own war. They sat on the hulls of their tanks, shaving, writing letters home, and watching the black smoke billow from the oil refineries in Dunkirk. It hung over the horizon like a funeral shroud. To the soldiers on the ground, it looked like the end of the world. But to the generals looking at the maps, that smoke was concealing a desperate miracle. This was the day Hermann Göring had promised to deliver victory from the air. But as the hours ticked by, the limitations of his arrogance became clear. The Luftwaffe did arrive, but not with the obliterating force Hitler had been promised. The sky was filled with Stukas and Heinkels, raining high explosives onto the port and the beaches. The town of Dunkirk was turned into a skeletal ruin. The docks were smashed, but air power alone cannot hold ground. It cannot capture prisoners. And most importantly, it cannot stop a determined enemy from digging holes in the sand. While the bombs fell, the British troops on the beaches learned a terrifying new lesson: how to survive. They dug deeper into the dunes. They learned the rhythm of the air raids. They realized that the soft sand absorbed the shock of the explosions, reducing the lethality of the German bombs. Göring was smashing the buildings, but he was failing to break the spirit of the men. Back at the German High Command, the mood was shifting from confidence to anxiety. General Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff, was livid. He wrote in his diary that the interference from Hitler was madness. He could see the opportunity slipping away. The Halt order was based on the assumption that the British were trapped and would eventually surrender. Halder realized the truth that Hitler missed. The British weren't trying to hold Dunkirk. They were trying to leave. Every hour the Panzers sat idle was an hour the Royal Navy used to organize. In Dover, Admiral Ramsay was performing a logistical symphony. Destroyers, minesweepers, and ferries were being marshaled, and behind them, a stranger fleet was gathering. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, lifeboats. The call had gone out. The little ships were coming. By the afternoon of May 25th, the German tank commanders on the front line could physically see the enemy stiffening. Resistance patrols that had been skittish the day before were now fighting with grim determination. The British rear guard, the men tasked with dying to save their friends, were digging in at the canal crossings. They were mining the bridges. They were sighting their Bren guns. The easy walk into Dunkirk was gone. The door that had been wide open was now being slammed shut, inch by bloody inch. Hitler remained at his headquarters, obsessed with the next phase of the war, the conquest of Paris. He believed the battle for the north was already won. He saw the map and saw a trap. He didn't see the sea. He didn't understand that, for a maritime nation like Britain, the sea wasn't a barrier. It was a highway home. As the sun set on the 25th, the 48-hour window was nearly closed. The Panzer crews went to sleep that night with a gnawing sense of unease. They hadn't moved a mile, and out in the darkness of the channel, the water was beginning to churn with the wake of 1,000 ships. The rescue was underway, and the Germans were still waiting for the phone to ring. May 26th, 1940, 1:30 p.m. 48 hours had passed since the engines were cut. 48 hours of silence. 48 hours of digging. Finally, the message came down from Hitler's headquarters. Permission granted. Resume the attack. The halt order was lifted. The leash was removed. The German commanders, eager to make up for lost time, shouted their orders. The engines roared back to life, belching blue smoke into the French air. The tracks began to spin. The Einst Panzer Division, the SS Leibstandard, the Großdeutschland Regiment, the entire steel fist of the Wehrmacht lurched forward to crush the pocket once and for all. But as the tanks rolled across the bridges of the Aa Canal, they realized immediately that the battlefield had changed. The fluid, chaotic war of movement they had dominated for 2 weeks was gone. In its place was something ugly, static, and brutal. On May 24th, they would have been chasing a fleeing mob. On May 26th, they slammed into a wall. The British rearguard had used the pause masterfully. Every bridge was mined. Every farmhouse was a fortress. Every hedgerow concealed an anti-tank gun. The British soldiers knew they were the only thing standing between their comrades on the beaches and total annihilation. They weren't fighting for territory anymore. They were fighting for seconds. The German advance, usually measured in miles per hour, was now measured in yards per hour. In the village of Wormhout, SS troops ran into a meat grinder. At the Ypres-Comines Canal, the British infantry held the line with nothing but rifles and Bren guns against armor. The German tank commanders, accustomed to seeing enemies break and run at the sight of a panzer, were shocked by the ferocity of the resistance. This was the courage of despair. General Guderian watched his tanks burning in the fields. The easy victory had evaporated. He was now forced to spend precious men and machines to retake ground that had been open for the taking just 2 days prior. The frustration in the German command vehicles was palpable. They were hammering against a shield that had hardened while they watched. And while the panzers bled on the perimeter, the miracle at the coast began in earnest. Operation Dynamo was officially underway. From the German observation posts, the sea looked like it was moving. It wasn't just waves, it was ships, hundreds of them. Destroyers cutting through the water, paddle steamers, fishing trawlers. A chaotic, desperate armada was ferrying men from the beaches to the larger ships. The Luftwaffe returned, screaming down from the clouds to punish the fleet. The water erupted in geysers of white foam and black smoke. Ships were hit. Men died in the freezing water. But for every ship the Germans sank, Two more seemed to appear out of the mist. To the German High Command, this was baffling. They couldn't understand the logic. Why risk a navy to save a defeated army? In the German military tradition, a surrounded army surrenders. It preserves its honor and avoids useless slaughter. But the British were breaking the rules. They were running away, but they were doing it with a stubbornness that looked dangerously like victory. By the evening of May 26th, the German pincers were closing, but they weren't snapping shut. The gap was still there. The corridor to the sea remained open. The halt order had done its damage. The momentum of the Blitzkrieg had been broken, not by the enemy, but by a phone call from Berlin. And now, the price of that call was being paid in the blood of German tankers and the escape of an entire army. The sun set on a battlefield that was burning. The easy kill was gone. Now it was a siege. May 27th brought a new enemy to the German Panzer crews, the terrain. The halt order had delayed them long enough for the British to retreat into a landscape that was the natural enemy of the tank. This was Flanders. It was a maze of canals, dikes, and flooded fields. Guderian's Panzers, designed for the open plains of Russia or the rolling hills of France, were now slogging through mud. The British had opened the sluice gates. The water level rose. The easy kill was turning into a swampy nightmare. Every time a German tank tried to maneuver off-road to flank a British position, it bogged down. The Blitzkrieg had lost its wheels. While the ground war slowed to a crawl, the air war reached a fever pitch. But here, too, the German plan began to unravel. Hermann Göring had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would prevent the escape, but on May 27th, he faced an enemy he couldn't bully: the weather. Low clouds and smoke from the burning oil tanks drifted over the beaches, obscuring the targets. The Stuka pilots, diving blind, often pulled up without releasing their bombs. And when the clouds broke, the Royal Air Force was there. For the first time in the campaign, German bombers were meeting stiff, organized resistance in the air. The Spitfires, operating from bases in southern England, were fighting like demons to protect the evacuation fleet. The German infantry on the ground looked up, expecting to see their air force clearing the path. Instead, they saw dogfights. They saw Heinkels falling from the sky. But the greatest drama was unfolding on a narrow wooden breakwater jutting out into the sea, the East Mole. The beaches were shallow. The large destroyers couldn't get close enough. The evacuation was moving too slowly. Then, a British naval officer made a desperate decision. He ordered the ships to dock alongside the East Mole. It was a flimsy wooden structure, never designed to dock warships, and certainly not designed to hold thousands of men. It became the lifeline. Under constant shell fire and strafing, British destroyers pulled up to the wood planks. Soldiers ran, didn't walk, ran along the narrow walkway, and jumped onto the ships. It was a conveyor belt of survival. Just as the British seemed to be stabilizing the corridor, disaster struck from the flank. May 28th. The King of Belgium surrendered. The Belgian army, holding the line to the left of the British, laid down its arms. Suddenly, a 20-mile gap opened in the Allied defense. The German 6th Army saw the opening. They poured into the breach. This should have been the end. The German generals saw the checkmate. They could pour through the Belgian gap and cut the British off from the sea completely. The Panzers revved their engines, sensing the final collapse. But General Alan Brooke, commanding the British II Corps, performed a miracle of improvisation. In the chaos of the retreat, he grabbed every available unit artilleryman without guns, truck drivers, cooks, and threw them into the gap. It was a line held together by sheer willpower. The Germans attacked the new line with fury. They hammered it with artillery. They probed it with tanks. But the ragtag British line held just long enough. Back at German headquarters, the mood turned grim. The reports coming in were confusing. They were taking thousands of prisoners, French and Belgian soldiers who had been left behind. But the hardcore of the British army, the professionals, the veterans, were vanishing. They weren't surrendering. They were melting into the sea. German artillery spotters adjusted their binoculars. They could see the ships leaving, not just one or two. Convoys. They were overloaded, sitting low in the water, decks gray with the uniforms of escaped men. The German guns fired, sending plumes of water into the sky, but the ships kept moving. The halt order had given the British time to dig in. Now, the failure to crush the perimeter quickly was giving them time to leave. The German generals realized with horror that they were winning the battle for the land, but they were losing the battle for the enemy's soul. The cage was closing, but the bird had already flown. May 29th, 1940. The German artillery commanders, peering through their rangefinders, couldn't believe what they were seeing. The sea was no longer just filled with gray warships. It was covered in a chaotic, colorful swarm. The little ships had arrived. From the German perspective, this was a violation of the laws of war. They were fighting a modern, mechanized conflict against a superpower. Yet here came a flotilla of pleasure yachts, Thames River barges, fishing trawlers, and lifeboats. It looked like a regatta, not a military operation. But this mosquito fleet was doing what the destroyers couldn't. They were sailing right into the shallows. They were picking up soldiers directly from the sand and ferrying them to the larger ships in deep water. It was a bucket brigade of survival, operating under a sky filled with screaming Stukas. The German gunners adjusted their elevation. They fired. Geysers of water erupted among the small boats. A yacht would vanish in a splinter of wood and fiberglass. A barge would capsize. But the swarm didn't stop. For every boat the Germans sank, 3 more took its place. The German military machine, designed to crush armies, found itself trying to swat a swarm of bees with a sledgehammer. While the evacuation accelerated on the beaches, another tragedy was playing out inland, one that would save Dunkirk but doom the defenders. The French First Army. General Molinier and 40,000 French soldiers were surrounded at Lille, 30 miles inland. They had been cut off during the retreat. Hitler and the German High Command wanted them crushed immediately. They threw 7 German divisions against the French pocket at Lille, 7 divisions that could have been marching on Dunkirk. For 4 days, the French fought with the fury of the condemned. They held the suburbs. They fought house to house. They tied down critical German resources, including tank divisions that were desperately needed at the coast. General Guderian, finally moving again, but frustrated by the slow progress, looked at his maps. He saw the problem clearly. The Halt order had caused a traffic jam. The German army was tripping over itself. Infantry divisions were blocking the roads for the tanks. The siege of Lille was consuming ammunition and air support. The unified, lightning-fast spearhead had fractured into a dozen messy street fights. By the evening of May 29th, the evacuation numbers skyrocketed. 47,000 men were taken off in a single day. German intelligence officers intercepted the radio traffic. They did the math. They realized with a cold dread that the British weren't just saving a few clerks and cooks. They were saving the battalions, the regiments, the core of the professional army. The German tank crews, halted just a few miles away, could hear the naval guns of the British fleet pounding the German inland positions. The prey had grown teeth. The Royal Navy destroyers were coming in close, risking grounding, to provide direct fire support for the infantry on the perimeter. It was a humiliation for the Wehrmacht, the most powerful army in history. The conquerors of Poland and destroyers of France were being held at bay by a shrinking line of exhausted infantry and a fleet of civilian boats. Hitler's decision to halt the tanks on May 24th was now revealing its true cost. He had traded a decisive strategic victory for a few days of maintenance and a political power play against his generals. He had assumed the Luftwaffe could finish the job. But, as the sun set on May 29th, the Luftwaffe was exhausted. The pilots were flying 4-5 sorties a day. They were losing planes to the RAF and to the wall of anti-aircraft fire from the ships. The trap Göring had promised was full of holes. And through those holes, the British Army was slipping away, leaving behind their heavy equipment, their trucks, and their guns, but taking with them the one thing Germany couldn't replace, their fighting spirit. May 30th, 1940. The German perimeter tightened like a noose, but inside the circle, the British Army was performing a vanishing act. To the German forward observers, the beaches of Dunkirk began to look less like a military encampment and more like a vast industrial graveyard. As the British retreated toward the water, they made a cold, calculated trade. They traded their firepower for their lives. German tank crews, finally breaking through the outer defense lines, rolled past endless columns of abandoned trucks. They saw field guns spiked and left in ditches. They saw mountains of ammunition crates, Bren carriers with their engines smashed, and piles of rifles. They saw the entire heavy inventory of the British Expeditionary Force left rotting in the French mud. General Halder, reviewing the reports in Berlin, felt a sickening realization. The German army was capturing territory, yes. They were capturing equipment, tons of it. But they weren't capturing men. A modern army needs tanks and guns to fight, but it takes months to build a tank. It takes 20 years to grow a soldier. The British were saving the hardware of their nation's soul, leaving the metal shell behind. On the beaches, the chaos had evolved into a grim routine. The little ships were relentless, but nature itself seemed to be conspiring against the Third Reich. The English Channel, a body of water notorious for its violent, unpredictable storms, remained uncannily calm. It was flat as a mill pond. This miracle of the weather allowed the smallest riverboat's craft that should have capsized in open water to ferry soldiers day and night. But the Germans were not done. If they couldn't stop the boats, they would slaughter the men waiting for them. German artillery was now within range of the beaches. They began a methodical bombardment. The sand turned into a killing ground. There was no cover. The soldiers simply had to stand in lines, shoulder deep in the water, waiting for a boat or a shell. Discipline held. Men stood in queues, as if waiting for a bus in London, while shrapnel tore through the water around them. Inland, the burden of defense was shifting. As the British pulled back, the French army took over the perimeter. It is one of the forgotten tragedies of Dunkirk. To allow the British to escape, 30,000 French soldiers stayed behind to man the barricades. They fought with the knowledge that there would likely be no boat for them. They were buying time with blood. By May 31st, the numbers were staggering. Over 160,000 men had been rescued. The German high command was paralyzed by the scale of it. They had declared Dunkirk a closed trap days ago. Now, the trap was leaking like a sieve. Hitler arrived in Brussels on June 1st. He was touring the conquered capitals, preparing for the victory parade. He looked at the maps and saw the red lines of his panzers converging on the coast. He declared the battle won. He didn't understand that the battle wasn't about the map. It was about the roster. The German soldiers on the ground knew better. They cleared a farmhouse, only to find warm tea and empty cigarette packets. The enemy was always just gone. It was ghostly. The frustration among the panzer crews was boiling over. They had been the fastest army in the world, yet they had been outrun by a defeated enemy moving at a walking pace. As June began, the evacuation shifted almost entirely to night operations. The Luftwaffe had made daylight sailing suicidal, so, under the cover of darkness, the Mosquito fleet returned, guided by the fires of the burning oil refineries. The German army prepared for the final squeeze. They brought up the heavy mortars. They positioned the railway guns. They were done waiting. If they couldn't capture the British army, they would bury it in the sand. The end was near, but the British had one final, defiant card to play. The British Expeditionary Force was gone. At 11:30 p.m., Captain William Tennant, the senior naval officer ashore, sent a two-word signal to Dover. BEF evacuated. It was the final confirmation. The professional army of Britain had escaped. Now, only the French remained. For the German forces pressing in from the perimeter, the battle had shifted tone completely. The frantic, desperate energy of the previous days was replaced by a grim, mechanical slaughter. The French rearguard, specifically the 12th Motorized Infantry Division, was fighting for a country that had already effectively fallen. They held the line at the canal, not to save themselves, but to allow the last few ships to load. General Guderian's tanks, now fully unleashed, but too late to matter, crushed the remaining pockets of resistance. But every time they broke through a line, they found emptiness. The enemy wasn't routing, they were evaporating. On the night of June 3rd, the final act of the tragedy played out. The little ships had gone home. Now, only the older, slower destroyers dared to approach the mole one last time. They took on as many French soldiers as they could, about 26,000 men that night. But as dawn approached, the German artillery became too intense. The ships had to leave. On the concrete of the mole, thousands of French soldiers stood and watched the sterns of the Allied ships disappear into the mist. They had been left behind. They dropped their rifles. They sat down. They waited for the Germans. June 4th, 1940. 10:20 a.m. The German 18th Army formally entered Dunkirk. There was no battle for the city center. There was only silence, broken by the crunch of jackboots on broken glass. The swastika flag was raised over the old lighthouse. The German newsreels were there, filming the triumph. They filmed the surrender of 40,000 French prisoners. They filmed the burning oil tanks. They filmed the victory. But down on the beaches, the German generals were walking through a scene that haunted them. It stretched for miles, a graveyard of modern warfare. The sand was black with oil and covered with the wreckage of an empire. 65,000 vehicles, 2,500 heavy guns, 20,000 motorcycles, 400,000 tons of supplies. It was the greatest haul of military equipment in history. The German soldiers cheered. They climbed onto the abandoned British trucks, posing for photos with captured helmets. They thought the war was over. They saw the pile of metal and assumed the enemy was destroyed. But the generals Rundstedt, Guderian, Manstein, they looked at the beach with cold eyes. They saw what was missing. Where were the bodies? Where were the prisoners? A defeated army leaves behind corpses and columns of dejected men. This army had left behind only its shell. The colonel, the 338,000 trained officers, NCOs, and soldiers was gone. Hitler issued a directive declaring a total victory. He claimed the British army had been annihilated. But in private, the mood at OKW, High Command, was somber. They realized that the Halt order of May 24th had been the most expensive mistake of the war. They had captured the steel, but they had lost the war. Across the Channel, those 338,000 men were stepping off the trains in London. They were exhausted, unshaven, and unarmed, but they were alive, and more importantly, they were angry. The German generals stood on the dunes of Dunkirk, looking at the white cliffs of Dover in the distance. They were only 20 miles away, but without a navy, and now facing an army that had miraculously survived to fight another day, those 20 miles might as well have been a million. The 48 hours of hesitation had closed the door on a quick German victory. The Battle of France was over, but because of the delay, the Battle of Britain was about to begin. June 4th, 1940, the afternoon. While the Germans were inspecting the spoils of war on the French coast, a very different scene was unfolding across the Channel. The ports of Dover, Ramsgate, and Folkestone were overwhelmed. The Mosquito fleet was returning home. The men stepping off the boats looked like walking ghosts. They were unshaven, their uniforms were torn, many were barefoot, and almost all were unarmed. They had left their rifles in the French sand. In a traditional military sense, this was a defeated rabble. They expected to be court-martialed. They expected the civilian population to look at them with shame. But then, something strange happened. As the trains carrying these exhausted men pulled into the stations in London and the countryside, they weren't met with silence. They were met with cheers. Women handed them tea and sandwiches through the train windows. People lined the tracks, waving flags. The British public didn't see a defeated army. They saw their sons, their brothers, and their fathers returning from the jaws of death. The miracle of Dunkirk had done something that no military victory could have achieved. It had galvanized a nation. That afternoon, Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons. He had a difficult job. He had to balance the relief of the rescue with the cold reality of the military disaster. He knew that wars are not won by evacuations. But then, he delivered the words that would define the rest of the 20th century. He spoke of the failure in France, but he ended with a promise of absolute, unyielding resistance. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender. In Berlin, these words were met with confusion. Hitler had expected the fall of France to force Britain to the negotiating table. He assumed that with their army shattered and their heavy equipment lost, the British would be rational. They would accept a peace treaty that allowed Germany to dominate the continent. But the Halt order had an unintended psychological consequence. By allowing the core of the British army to escape, Hitler had allowed the British people to believe that they were survivors. If they could survive Dunkirk, they could survive anything. The German generals, now occupying the French coast, looked out at the English Channel. It was only 20 miles wide, but but it was the most formidable anti-tank ditch in the world. Guderian knew that his Panzers, the masters of the European plains, were useless against water. To cross that channel, Germany needed air superiority and naval control. They had neither. The window of opportunity to strike Britain while it was in chaos had lasted perhaps a week. That window was now closed. The British Army was reorganizing with frantic speed. The men who had escaped were being re-equipped. The factories were running 24 hours a day. The coastal defenses were being manned by the very soldiers who, just days before, had been queuing in the water at Bray Dunes. The irony was bitter. The Halt order had been issued to preserve the tanks for the final battle in France. They had won that battle, yes, but in doing so, they had lost the chance to end the war in 1940. Hitler now faced a strategic nightmare. He couldn't invade. He couldn't persuade them to quit. He was the master of Europe, but he was still at war, and the enemy he had let slip through his fingers was already looking up at the sky, waiting for the next phase. The Battle of France was history. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and the pilots of the Luftwaffe, who had failed to close the trap at Dunkirk, would now be asked to do the impossible. June 5th, 1940, and beyond. The smoke over Dunkirk finally cleared. The beaches were silent, save for the sound of the waves washing against the hulls of sunken ships. The German salvage crews were already at work, painting iron crosses on captured British trucks. On the surface, it was a picture of total conquest. The swastika flew from the North Cape of Norway to the Spanish border. But in the quiet corners of the German High Command, a cold realization was setting in. They had just won the most spectacular land campaign in modern history, yet the mood was not one of celebration, but of unease. General von Rundstedt and General Guderian knew the truth of warfare. You do not win by capturing territory. You win by destroying the enemy's will and ability to fight. At Dunkirk, they had captured the territory, but the enemy's will had only hardened, and their ability to fight had been ferried home. The Halt order of May 24th would go down in history as the first major crack in the infallibility of Adolf Hitler. It was the moment political paranoia overrode military necessity. For 48 critical hours, the German war machine, which had functioned like a precision watch, was stopped by its own user. Those 48 hours bought the world 4 more years of war. If the tanks had not stopped, the British Expeditionary Force would have been annihilated. Britain, stripped of its army and its leadership, would have likely been forced to sue for peace. The United States, seeing a fallen Europe, might never have entered the war in the West. The history of the 20th century turned on the hinge of that single delay. Back in Britain, the returning soldiers were not just survivors, they were the seeds of the future Allied armies. They would form the cadre of the forces that would fight in North Africa, in Italy, and eventually, 4 years later, return to France. When they returned on D-Day in 1944, they didn't come with broken rifles and fishing boats. They came with an armada of 7,000 ships and the industrial might of the free world. But that return was only possible because they had been allowed to leave in 1940. The miracle of Dunkirk also fundamentally changed the psychology of the war. Before Dunkirk, the German Blitzkrieg seemed supernatural, an unstoppable force of nature. But at Dunkirk, the spell was broken. The Germans had blinked, they had hesitated, and in that hesitation, the British saw that the monster was flawed. As the summer of 1940 heated up, the German generals turned their eyes upward. The Panzers were parked. The channel remained uncrossed. The job of finishing the war was passed from the army to the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring, who had failed to close the trap at the beaches, now promised to bomb Britain into submission. But he would find the skies over Kent far more dangerous than the skies over Poland. The pilots he sent against England would face the very men who had escaped the beaches, pilots who had been pulled from the water, given dry clothes, and put back in Spitfires. The German general stood on the coast of France, looking at the white cliffs of Dover shimmering in the heat haze. He had his tanks. He had his victory. But as he watched the seagulls wheeling over the empty channel, he understood the bitter irony of his position. He had won the battle of the land, but by halting his panzers, he had lost the war for the future. The enemy had escaped, and the next time they met, the panzers wouldn't be the ones chasing. They would be the ones burning. The 48 hours were over. The long war had just begun.